year because we are doing didactics certificate program here at the university, and she's visiting to give feedback on the lecture. But I didn't need to, so I'm very happy that she's here. There are a couple of preliminary things that I've talked about before we jump into the content. First is, remember last week we had the voting for the open lecture, for which topic you want to have for the lecture in February. And then there are 2 ballots which are anonymous, where you didn't write your name behind. And so if there, I don't know who did the assignment, right? Remember, voting was one assignment that you need to complete for the activity. And so I will just pass around.
I think
yeah, this is yours? Sorry, yeah. Okay, perfect. Then is there anyone else who, I will just pass around, and maybe if this was your ballot, just write the name at the back. Again, I don't care what you vote, it's just to know that you were here completely assigned. Okay?
So those of us who weren't there, they didn't complete the assignment?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so voting was part, even if you did the...
There were 2 assignments. One was to propose a topic. This was the take-home assignment. So everyone who proposed the topic on Blackboard fulfilled.
I don't know. I already wrote my name. Yeah.
You did?
Okay.
Yeah, I already wrote in before he said.
He said on the back just now.
But I cannot write 2 names there. Can I just write in front?
Why don't you write at the back?
Should I write here?
Yeah.
But I already write here before you said.
Fine. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, that's sorted. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on that?
I missed last week, so is there any way I can cash back on this assignment? Or?
No, not really. So like this was clearly communicated at the beginning that there are 5 assignments, and you have to do 4 to get the activity. And yeah, 2 already happened.
So if you miss 2 classes in which there's an assignment, then you failed, even though normally you are allowed to miss 2 classes at the institute?
No, because one is a take-home assignment, right?
Yes.
So it's not attached to the class. So the take-home assignment, you can miss 2 classes and still complete everything, because one of the assignments is a take-home. That was the first one, right? You didn't have to be here, just need to upload something on the Blackboard. Yeah. Yeah.
Will the other assignments also about the topic, like choosing
Exactly.
the topic?
The other assignments are the work you have to do to prepare for this lecture that you are doing in February. Yeah. And I've also reminded that the first in-class assignment, which was voting, I announced it beforehand, right, on Blackboard. So, yeah. Okay. 2 other announcements. The first one is that next week is going to be the Mental Health Awareness Week here at the campus. There are some events which are open for students. You can see here below. You can come without any pre-registration, so no barriers. You can just come if you think that's useful. I will encourage you to participate, and I will add this poster on Blackboard as well. Okay, so you can look in peace later on. And the last thing is, do you know which day was yesterday, the 25th of November? Okay. Yeah.
It's about, I don't know the right wording.
Yeah, in your words.
It's about harassing women, and think about it, what's happening, and like keep it in mind.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like International Day against for the elimination of all types of violence. And so as part of that occasion, the university also has 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks, until the 2nd of December, a lot of events and material on that topic. So here's just literally the home page of the university. You can click more to find more information. And very interesting was also from kind of the development economics class. Yesterday, the UN published their annual report on feminicides. Do you know what that is? Feminicide? Yeah.
The murder of women in a sexual context?
Exactly, so it's the murder, so it's the homicide, that's what side stands for. It's kind of the murder of women because of their gender, usually by a male murderer. And yeah, the numbers were that there are about 80,000 women who were killed in 2025. So up to this, sorry, in 2024, the date is always for the previous year. And of those, 60%, so around 50,000, were killed by a male relative or an intimate partner. Okay, they would count as feminicides. Do you know what is the share of male homicides? So where victims are male that are committed by an intimate partner or relative. So in women, is 60% of all women who are killed by an intimate partner or relative. By men, what is the share? Any guesses?
Maybe 5.
5. Other guesses?
1.
Other guesses? It's 11%. Right? So a bit above, but still, yeah, kind of a world apart, right? So that's kind of the most dangerous people in women's lives are male family members and intimate partners, which is absolutely insane. So there's a whole report on that. I might add a link to the report as well if you're interested. Okay, with that being said, let's jump to the topic of today, inequality. A bit like the discussion on global poverty, we'll first kind of fix ideas on how we might go about measuring it. With that measures, we will describe some global style stats. How does inequality look at the global level? And then we'll discuss theories that link either the effect that inequality might have for development, broadly understood, and vice versa. How does development, the process of development, might impact inequality? Okay, so we're going to discuss theories where, kind of, if you want to think like causality runs in both directions. Okay, and remember kind of the teaser at the end of last week was, you can think of inequality in many dimensions, just like development or poverty, and for the purposes of this class, we make it kind of, manageable in a 90 minutes lecture. We're just going to focus on inequality of income or inequality of wealth. And someone tell me kind of in an intuitive way, in your own words, what is the difference between income and wealth?
I think income refers to the wages that you earn through a job, and wealth is what you have as an asset, namely a house, you have investments in stock. It isn't only measured through income.
Wealth is mostly intergenerational, so you get it from past generations.
Yeah.
Mostly.
And income?
Income you earn like only in your lifetime, so like 15 years backwards.
Yeah, think of it as kind of the difference between the stock, which is wealth, that you can accumulate over time, over generations. It's measured in assets like a house, but also your banking savings, stocks, ownership of companies, all those things are wealth. It's a stock. And then income is kind of the flow that you derive from that stock. So for example, if you have a savings account in your bank, the total amount that is there counts as wealth. The interest rate that you get from having the money there would be income. Okay? Wages would be income. If you own a house and you rent it out, the rent you gain is income, but the total value of the house as well. Yeah? So stock and flows. Okay. But again, they are all kind of a monetary value, which is very easy to measure. It's easy to understand. So we're going to focus on that. Do you remember the difference between vertical inequality and horizontal inequality?
Vertical is mostly about income. For example, so in horizontal is like in groups. For example, if inequality in gender,
Yeah.
and vertical more like monetary basis.
Right. So I think the horizontal one could also be monetary basis, but it's more like you don't really care. It's anonymous. So you don't care who you are comparing. So vertical inequality would be like the gap between the 10% richest and the 10% poorest of society. Would be vertical inequality. I don't care who they are. I just care the gap between those two strata of society. Horizontal inequality, I define groups and I care about who they are. So the gender wage gap would be horizontal inequality. I have to first define very clearly what I mean by gender, which groups belong to which gender, to have a meaningful estimate of that. Racial inequality would be horizontal. Both groups and how far apart they are. Vertical inequality would kind of a relative position in stratified society, but I don't care which groups they belong to. Do you remember the concept of overlapping or intersectional inequalities? Yeah.
Two types of discrimination like overlap. If you discriminate because you're women, and you discriminate because of race, and then you discriminate because you're women and you're black, for example, and then like this left over.
And intersect in ways that are not, might be not obvious, right? So kind of that it might be just different from the combination of the isolated patterns of discrimination. So gender discrimination might on average be something, racial discrimination might on average be something, but then the discrimination of gender and race combined might be very different than just the sum of the two or a combination of the two. That's this idea of intersectionality. Right? Maybe there's the way different dimensions intersect and overlap is not easily just summing up the individual dimensions, but might create very complex patterns. You can think of many others, right? It could be race, gender, age, class, rural, urban, whatever, right? The intersection of many dimensions. And the last point, justice versus instrumental considerations. Do you remember what that refers to? What's this idea that kind of there's a normative perspective on inequality, which would be more like justice phase, where there might be different preferences for what is the appropriate level of inequality in society, and which kind of shape that inequality might have. And then that's something which we'll not discuss here so much. It'll be more of a philosophical moral discussion, which is interesting, but maybe I won't have so much to tell you on that. What I'll have to tell you more is like instrumental considerations. Inequality as having an effect on other outcomes that you might care about, like development in general. Right? And that's kind of inequality as an instrument for something else. Okay, any questions on this kind of setup?
I think that's where
Well, you might say, for example, they might be consulted with each other. You might say, for example, I find my personal preference is everyone should, to give a ridiculous example, to give a exaggerated example. Everyone should be absolutely equal, right? Kind of my justice, from a justice point of view, inequality should not exist. And at the same time, you might say, I recognize it from an instrumental perspective. For example, the fact that there is inequality creates incentives for people to work harder. Right? And there's kind of, it's not about, right? It's just a tool to make people work hard or people save more or whatever. Right? And those two things are very distinct. And the other way around, you might say, I don't know, I'm a libertarian, I'm heavily late, so I think it's unjust if everyone is the same, because people work hard differently, have different talents, so I think inequality should exist. It's a fair world is a world where there is inequality, because people are different and there should be freedom and so on. But at the same time, I might consider that too much inequality maybe creates instability in the system, might be bad for other reasons. Right? One is kind of your preference, your personal preference, purely from a justice point of view, and the other one is recognizing that this might have effects on other outcomes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, then how should we go about the measurement? Let's start. We'll focus on the vertical. Okay. So usually the first step is kind of a very stylized example. So imagine a society which has only 20 individuals, okay? And this is income inequality, so each one of them receives some income with the imaginary money units, okay? They nicely all sum up to 100. And then you rank them from poorest to richest, okay? So person number 1 is the poorest in society, receives 0.8. Person number 20 receives 15, it's the richest in terms of income. Yeah, they're all ranked in this order. And then usually, because you want to compare countries or different regions or different points in times where the population might be different, right? Instead of 20, you might have 100 or 200. What we usually do is to convert those absolute numbers into relative numbers. And so instead of saying the poorest 4 individuals of society, we say the poorest 5%. Right? And so in a society with 20 people, it's clear that the poorest 5% are the poorest 4. But in a society with 200 people, the poorest 5% are going to be the poorest 40. Right? If you convert everything into quintiles, you can compare the relative inequality of China with 1 billion people to, I don't know, convert with 500,000, right? Because it's then all about the relative, not the absolute number. And you do the same for income, right? So with income, again, you don't really care the amount of money each one of them makes. What you care is how much money relative to the total. Yeah? That's useful because then you can compare, countries with different currencies, different points in time, different inflation rates, whatever. Yeah? And so, in this case, you have, for example, that the poorest 5% would receive 3.2% of total. Yeah? Once you have those kind of measures, then you can compute ratios, which are the first type of metrics that might be intuitive. Right? So you might say one basic measure of inequality is just saying how much income do the X% richest earn relative to the Y% poorest. There are certain ratios which are relatively commonly used in the literature or in discussions. One is the Kuznets ratio, which compares the top 20% to the bottom 40%. Okay? Nowadays, because state is much better at capturing incomes at the top. We'll talk about that later. A very common one is the one used by Thomas Piketty and co-authors at the World Inequality Lab. We're going to see a lot of the data they produce later on. They use, for example, the top 10% relative to the bottom 50%. And the richest 10% relative to the median of the population. To the 50%, the half of the population. Okay, so think of the kind of data you need for this. Ideally, you would need to know the individual income of everyone, every individual living in society, right? Of course, that's kind of not feasible. So then what most measures of inequality will use is household surveys. Do you know what a survey is? Household survey. And how does that work?
If I go to like every household, or not every, but a section, one sample, let's say 20,000, or maybe in the country it's Germany, it's more about 10 million, and then they can throw it like to the whole population, and they ask like questions about income relate. It's about the topic then, but how much income do you have? Is it two income people in the household, like mother and father, and so it's about more a question based.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have a full population count, that would be what we call a census. That's usually done in 10 years because it's extremely expensive and complicated to run. And then usually what countries will do in the years in between is household surveys, which is exactly what we described. Like instead of trying to interview every single person living in the country in every single household, we take a random sample of, usually it's not 10 million, it's like 10,000 people. That's enough, right? So think of like 0.5% of the population. And then you ask them, it's really kind of sometimes a 2-3 hour interview, where you ask them everything about who lives there, what do they do, how much income do they earn from different sources, you might ask wealth, and so on and so forth. The problem of those type of surveys is you won't catch the top of the income distribution for 2 reasons. The first one is just statistical lack, right? So if you take kind of a random sample of 1% of the population, the chance in Germany, the chance that you get the owner of Lidl and Aldi there, it's close to 0, right? The very, very rich guys are very rare. And so with a random survey, you won't catch them. Second reason is, even if you would catch them, the likelihood that they are willing to answer 2-3 hours of questions about their wealth and income is close to 0, right? So those surveys, people have to agree on participating, and there's a very famous empirical fact that the richer you are, the more likely, the richer the respondent, the more likely they are to refuse to participate in those surveys. Okay? And so those surveys do a very bad job at capturing the very, very top of the income distribution. And that explains why older measures usually use kind of the top 20 as the richest. That's kind of how far you could go up and still be relatively sure that you're measuring well, but you could not capture like the top 20, the top 5, the top 1%. And the big innovation of Piketty, and Piketty started, that now has a huge group of people working on that, is that they realize, okay, so household surveys are terrible to capture the rich. We actually have another data source which is pretty good. And those are tax records. Okay? This is a silly joke of the 2 things which are inevitable in life, death and taxes, right? And the idea is that the state, most states, do a good job in capturing income of the very rich through tax collection. Yeah? That's something that happens on a yearly basis. In France, the country where Piketty started doing this, it goes back to the French Revolution. So you have kind of almost 300 years of tax record data, and there it's very good to capture the top incomes. Okay? It will not capture people at the bottom of the distribution. Right? Most of them will fall below the minimum amount income you need to pay taxes, or they might work informally and not pay taxes and so on. But for the very rich, it's a very good source of data. Yeah? And so that's why once you combine the 2 types of data, you are able to get at much more precise measures at the top. So if Piketty has estimates for the top 0.01% of the population, which is really very detailed estimate. Okay, those are all kind of ratio measures. They are a bit rough because they ignore anything else other than those 2 points, right? They are silent on inequality among the bottom 50%, and they are silent about inequality between those 2 groups, right? So it's just kind of 1 point, another point, although you have much more going on. Here are some numerical examples. And so there's another very famous measure, which is the Gini coefficient, which will include data from the whole distribution, not just from two points. Okay. So the first thing we need, or I think that the best way to understand the Gini coefficient is geometrically, from a graphical representation. And so what we do is kind of convert this table into a graph. And we have 2 axes. On the horizontal axis, you have the percentage of the population, again, ordered from poorest to richest. Okay, so this 10% will be the 10% poorest, 20% poorest, until you reach 100%, the whole population. And then you do the same on the y-axis, but for income. Okay. And then you know, and then you can kind of plot, how much income does the 10% poorest of the population earn, and then you plot that. Here would be, I don't know, 4%, 5%. Yeah? You do this for, in this case, for all percentiles of the distribution, then you can draw the line that connects that. That line is called the Lorentz curve. Yeah?
Is it just me, or does it seem unrealistic with the Lorentz curve? Because shouldn't it go much lower and then raise much quicker to have the real image of the world?
Okay, let's go.
Is it an example, or is it
it's just an example.
Okay,
Perfect. That's exactly what I want to go. So, from the shape of the Lorentz curve, you can answer the question: is the society more or less equal? Okay, and I guess that's where you want to go. So imagine a society where everyone earns the same. So it's perfect equality. Then I won't ask you because the spoiler is already here, right? So then the Lorentz curve will be this diagonal line, right? And the intuition is, in a society where everyone earns the same, the poorest 10%, how much do they earn? Well, they must earn 10% of the income. The poorest 20%, how much do they earn? They must earn 20%. Everyone earns the same. So every 10% earns 10%. Yeah. So you have this diagonal line where this side is exactly the same as this side. And so then you already get this situation. The closer the Lorentz curve is to this line, the more equal the society is. What would be the line of perfect inequality? The other extreme.
It would be right angle. It's just the x-axis, and then we'll go up to the 100% point.
Yeah. So then a society which is perfectly unequal is a society where everyone earns 0, and then there's one single person which earns everything. And so that's this line, right? It's the axis. All these guys earn 0, and the last person, the richest one, earns 100%. And so the closer the Lorentz line is to this part, the more unequal the society is. Yeah? And so the one which is drawn here is simply an example. It doesn't represent any real country or region. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay. If that makes sense, then the Gini coefficient should make a lot of sense. The Gini coefficient has some kind of formula. It basically compares income differences between all possible pairs of individuals in society. It's there, you can see it, but I will just now ignore it and focus on the kind of geometrical intuition, which I think is much easier. The Gini coefficient is the area A. What is the area A? It's the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorentz curve divided by the total triangle. Yeah? And so now make this thought experiment. Think of this line, and now inequality starts to fall. What is happening? This line is slowly going up, right? If inequality is completely abolished, the Lorentz curve becomes this line. Yeah? In this process, what is happening to area A? It's becoming smaller and smaller. Yeah? So the Gini coefficient is becoming closer and closer to 0. In the limit, when the Lorentz curve is exactly the line of inequality, the Gini coefficient is 0. Yeah? Because area A is 0. Now think of the other scenario. Inequality is increasing, so the Lorentz curve is going down and slowly approaching the line of perfect inequality. Area A is increasing, right? So the Gini coefficient goes up. In the limit, when the Lorentz curve is exactly the same as this area, as this line, sorry, then area A is the same as the whole triangle. And then the Gini coefficient is 1. Yeah? Okay? So the Gini coefficient is something that has this nice boundary. It varies between 0 and 1, 0, perfect equality, 1, perfect inequality. Yeah? You know, this geometrical way of thinking, I guess it becomes a much more intuitive measure.
Is the Gini coefficient limited to the percentage of, to those variables, like to the percentage of income? Could you also do like the percentage of wealth? Because I think that
Exactly.
is
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah. Yeah. So everything that you can convert that is kind of a well-defined unit of measurement, you can calculate the Gini coefficient of. The Gini coefficient of years of schooling, of weight, of height, whatever you want. Yeah? Okay. I'll open up relatively quickly like 4 nice properties that the Gini coefficient has. So for example, maybe go back. This sounds silly, but like one way of measuring inequality in prehistorical times, from data from archaeologists, is skeleton height. So in the past, like wealthier and healthier people were bigger. And so if you look, you know, archaeologists dig up graves of people, measure the skeletons, and then from the Gini coefficient of the size, you get a pretty good idea how equal or unequal society was. If there was an elite, a rich elite, you will see skeletons which are much, much larger than the rest. That's just one example. Okay, there are 4 properties of the Gini index which are very make it kind of an interesting measure. The first one is for vertical inequality, actually. The first one is anonymity. That's kind of almost obvious, right? Like it's not so interesting. Because you're defining the population in this relative bins, right? The 1%, 10%, 5%, you don't really care who is where. You just care kind of how much the slice of the pie of income that they receive. In this case, you don't care if they are male, female, ethnic group, age, rural, urban, doesn't matter. Right? So in that sense, it's anonymous. You can shift the richest guy and the poorest guy, and inequality doesn't change. Right? It's scale independent. So it doesn't depend on the currency you're measuring, does not depend on the size of the population. Again, that's great to compare. Right? You can compare the Gini coefficient of China now to the Gini coefficient of Berlin in the 18th century, if you want. This is kind of well defined. Yeah. And again, this is because everything is just in percentages of the population, in percentages of income, and not in absolute numbers. Yeah. And so it doesn't depend on the scale. It doesn't depend on the population. That's the same idea. And then to really capture, or for us to be sure that it captures inequality, it also obeys the transfer principle. What does that mean? That means if this is the starting point, you have an initial Gini, and then imagine there's a transfer of income or wealth from someone who's relatively richer to someone who's relatively poorer. The Gini coefficient should go Go up or go down? Yeah.
Stay the same.
Why? No. Someone is relatively richer.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry.
A rich person is getting poor and a poor person is getting rich.
Yeah.
They
There's a-
switch.
Yeah. No, not the switch. There's the transfer. Yeah. There's the transfer. But the transfer is not 100%. Yeah. So intuitively, inequality goes up or down. Yeah. Sorry, maybe not this side.
Go up.
Why? If you take from a rich guy and give it to a poor person, why should the inequality go up?
Should go down.
Should go down, exactly. Perfect. And so you should see the Gini also go down. And that's a property of the measure. Yeah, it happens. Okay, and vice versa. If you take something from a relatively poor person and give it to a relatively richer person, the Gini goes up. Mechanically. And so it captures this intuitive notion of inequality. If you give the 100%, they would switch, that doesn't matter. That's true. Yeah. Okay. So here's some data on this. So remember what we did a bit at the beginning, which was comparing the Human Development Index, the rank of countries in the Human Development Index, and the rank of countries in GDP per capita. We can do the same with inequality a bit. So there's one kind of adaptation of the Human Development Index that takes into account inequality. And that is called the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. And then you can compare how countries do in relative terms in both measures, just like we did with GDP. And then the first thing to notice is, because there's inequality in every country in the world, right? Remember the HDI dimensions? Or the HDI dimensions? What is inside the Human Development Index? Yeah.
I think birth rate, income,
Income, yes.
and
I guess you're confusing birth rate with life expectancy.
yeah,
So
life
those are
expectancy
expectancies.
is sort of
The birth, which was health, GNI per capita, so income per capita, and the first one was
Education.
education. It's like mean years of education or expected years of education. That was always the average of the population. What the inequality adjusted one does is give a penalty for countries where all those three measures are unequally distributed. And so the first thing to realize is, of course, all countries are equal to a certain extent. And so the inequality adjusted HDI is always below the HDI, which doesn't take into account inequality. But then, of course, depending on how unequal you are, this penalty is larger, right? And you can compare those two rankings. So Norway, for example, which has the highest HDI, also has the highest inequality adjusted HDI. That's maybe not surprising, it's a very relatively equal country. Remember, the Gini coefficient goes from 0 to 1, here they are in percentage points, so it's from 0 to 100. And Norway, which is one of the most equal countries in the world, has a Gini of like 27%. And so they have the same ranking. They are number one in both measures. Countries which are red are countries which do worse when you take into account inequality. Because of Germany, which loses 4 spots in the ranking. For countries which are very unequal, like Brazil and South Africa, two of the most unequal countries in the world. You see, once you take into account inequality, they drop kind of 20 spots in the ranking of most countries with the most human development. And then the flip side are countries which do better, and those are typically former socialist countries, like Moldova, which is even more equal than Norway. If you take into account equality, that's much better than if you only take into account human development. Yeah.
Is there a causality between the higher GDP per capita and the lower Gini? Because, for example, now Brazil is
that's exactly what this will be about. Yeah. So also complain if you think if that question is not answered. Yeah, and you already have a feeling for the magnitudes. Okay, so kind of some of the most equal countries in the world have a Gini of between 20 and 25. Some of the most unequal have a Gini of like 60. Between 50 and 60 is very, very high. Okay, so now that we have the Gini and we know what those ratios are, and we know the difference between income and wealth, we are ready to see how the world works out. And I guess it should not be surprising by now at this stage of the semester that the world is extremely unequal. Right? It's kind of at the global level. So imagine we're all one country, just comparing incomes of everyone living in the globe, and you get things like the richest 10% of the population in the world gets 52% of total income, and they own 76% of all the wealth there. Okay, so we're about 8 billion people now. So when I talk here about the top 10%, I'm talking about 800 million people. So think of like kind of European Union plus US plus Japan, and that's more or less 800 million. Yeah? And so everyone in this room is definitely here. And here. Yeah. The top 1%, those will be kind of the richest 80 million people in the world, like the size of Germany. They own, the richest 1% owns 38% total wealth. Yeah. And then if you compare to the poorest 10%, sorry, the bottom 50%, it's zero, right? Okay. So I'll put it again. The richest 80 million people in the world own 38% of total wealth that is out there. The bottom 4 billion own 2%. Yeah. Okay? Think about that for a minute. It's insane. Huh? But that's the world we live in. Okay. Why is wealth more unequally distributed than income? Kind of intuitively. That's always the case. We'll always find inequality in wealth is higher than inequality in income.
Because I think that wealth can aggregate and the income cannot.
Okay. So inequality is much, as we mentioned before, it's much easier to pass on for generations, right? And it's kind of much more durable, right? And wage lasts for your working life, while a house or a bank account lasts for many centuries. So it's much easier to accumulate. Okay, now the big question is, this is mixing two types of inequality are hidden here. One is inequality between countries, right? Is this driven by the fact that some countries are much richer than others? That's one type of inequality. The other one is, within a country, we also have inequality between different groups. Okay, so think of this kind of mixing between country inequality and within country inequality. The fact that the average person in Germany is much richer than the average person in India, and that within Germany and within India, there are much richer people. Some people are much richer than others. And so let's try to decompose those two facts. And we know from the lecture of economic growth that in the last years, in the last decades, we have seen convergence, unconditional convergence in GDP per capita between countries. Who remembers what I mean by that? What is unconditional convergence? Yeah.
So we have two states we converge to, and we have one number of countries converge to a higher state. In long term, that's mostly the richest countries, so Caribbean countries and also Latin American countries, which are converging to a lower steady state, and they're like trapped in this, so it's hard to, or it's not even impossible maybe. For example, in Germany, after the World War II, they got a lot of help from other countries, so they could converge to the upper one. But
Yeah, I agree. But then remember, we saw it like since the 80s or the 90s, there is unconditional convergence between countries. What does that mean? What does that process mean? Are countries becoming more equal or more unequal between themselves? Yeah?
I think countries were getting more equal.
Countries are getting more equal. Yeah.
And there was also a trend, I think it started in the 2000s, that the countries started catching up faster than the other ones.
So for most of, we're going to see that later. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution till the 80s, countries on average were getting more unequal. But since then, since the 80s, countries are becoming much more equal. Yeah. And that's something you see here. So this is the distribution of per capita income. This is the international poverty line. And then different colors have different world regions. Okay? And so what you see here is, in 1800s, the world was very equal, right? There were not many differences between different regions, and everyone was very poor, right? Most of the world population is below the $2 a day international poverty line. Fast forward 200 years later, and you have the situation where you have like two groups. A group with relatively richer countries, right? And they're mostly in Europe, North and South America, and very few in Asia Pacific, as in Japan and South Korea, and Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. And then still the vast majority of the world population lives in clearly another average, right, which is much poorer. It's roughly the same as it was in 1800. So it's still like between here and here, inequality exploded between countries, right? This world is much more unequal than this one. It's much richer on average, but it's much more unequal. Since then, it's kind of the the 80s, what you have is the opposite trend. So mainly because countries which are poor have grown much faster than countries which are rich, you have a situation like this. There are still vast differences in income, right? Countries here are much poorer than countries there, but kind of the distribution has become much more equal. And everyone has become more. Everyone is richer now and more equal. Does that make sense? So we can see that's displaying out over time. And here you see kind of the Gini index of global inequality, which in 1988 was 72%. Kind of at the world level, it's higher than South Africa, which is the most unequal country. To put this number into some sort of benchmark. This is data from our world in data. They use this term developed countries, which I would not use. Okay? But this is kind of the figure I got from their website. I would call them high income countries or something else. There's no such thing as a developed countries if this process is finished. Right?
and this would also go like advanced countries. Sometimes they talk about advanced, so you would always refer to income.
Right. So I think those kind of things which like describe a feature as if this, they have advanced and now they are the advanced. That's kind of very, to me it sounds very silly, right? And then you can say, you can think of like, think of the US nowadays, is this an advanced country? I'm not sure. Right? So I'll just keep it kind of either like regions, I think that's a good way of describing it, it's kind of a regional geographical unit that you can define well, or by income groups, which is also something good. It's kind of as a criteria. But anyway, 1988, 1993, 1988, 1988, 93, 98, inequality is going down a bit, and you see this process of kind of from two mountains So here's a picture which I think is really, really interesting, which tells you kind of the evolution of the two types of inequality that between countries. That's the one with the sun, right? And then within a country. Right? And then you have kind of this Piketty ratio. So this is the ratio of the richest 10% relative to the bottom 50% of the population. So you would read a number like this as, you know, in 1820, the richest 10% within a country on average earned, this is wealth, this is income earned, I don't know, 14 times more than the bottom 50% of the population. Yeah. So what is the story here? The story here is early 19th century. The main source of inequality in the world is inequality between rich and poor within that country. Inequality between countries is very low. Right? That makes sense. That's this world. Yeah. What really matters is, you know, in which caste you are born in India. Are you part of the peasantry or are you part of the aristocracy in Europe? It's kind of, those are class-based societies, very stratified, and that's what mattered. It didn't matter so much whether you were born in England or China or India. This played a much larger role. What matters was within a country in which part of the social strata you were born. Yeah.
Do you have an idea where this data comes from? Like, where was it analyzed to know how it was in 1820?
This is mostly tax records. So you know, yeah. So if you think, like, I know it sounds almost like impossible to believe. But you have to think of two things. One is like there were very few people who paid taxes at the time, because most of society was extremely poor. Okay, and then there were a few strata who would be rich enough to pay taxes. Then populations were much smaller, so it's kind of easier to reconstruct the data. And they usually have some kind of record, right? For example, I don't know, medieval monasteries in Europe, they would have a very complex and sophisticated system of accounting what they produced, how much they extracted, how much tax they paid, and so on and so forth. And so you can kind of recreate the distribution based on that data. Yeah. It's like the life work of Piketty, so it's something spent 20, 30 years doing. So it's behind this kind of, behind a graph like this, it's kind of 30 years of work. But the idea is like it can be done. The data is there. Okay. Yeah.
What caused this big shift in the pedagogy of the 20th century?
Right. Okay. So this is the starting point. Yeah. Then what happens is this process of some countries, mostly in Western Europe, US, and so on, start growing at a sustained pace, while most of the others don't. And that's what makes this big rise in between country inequality. Right? This process we described in the economic growth lecture, of takeoff of some countries while others stay behind. And so between country inequality explodes. That's the period known as the Great Divergence. You see it peaks in the 1980s. Within country inequality at the beginning is kind of flat, so you're going up a bit, doesn't move much. Then there are kind of two events which bring it down. What could that be? A smaller one and a very large one.
You have the World War, and then after the World War you have like development policies like the Marshall Plan and so forth.
So here's kind of First World War, Great Depression. It's a small one, but still very large. And here's the Second World War. Right? Why would the Second World War destroy inequality within country inequality?
Because a lot of things are destroyed, a lot of wealth is destroyed.
Yeah. What are bad for inequality because most of assets are destroyed. Right? So this takes a hit. And then for the first time in human history, the global inequality is more, the biggest factor is inequality between countries than inequality within countries. So here it matters more where you are born than which social class you belong to within a country. That's kind of this is the period where this is the main, it's kind of, for the first time, right? And since the 80s, you have two forces that go in opposite directions. You have this massive convergence of income per capita between countries, so inequality between countries goes down very fast. Right? And at the same time, since the 1980s, you have inequality within countries exploding. Yeah? So this kind of period of low inequality in relative terms that was a result of the Second World War comes to an end, and we are back at the levels of inequality we had in the 19th century. Yeah? And so nowadays, we are again flipped. Yeah, nowadays, we are back, we're in a world that looks much more like the 19th century looked. So much more kind of a class-based world than what the 20th century used to look. And if you look in this panorama, the 20th century is kind of the exception. Right? This looks much more like how it used to be before. Yeah.
But does the income matter that much? Like the wealth is, I think, way much more important right now because like everybody lives on their previous generation.
Yeah. So the thing is, like, between country wealth is very tricky to measure because between country income is kind of GDP, more or less. Within country wealth is a bit more difficult. But what you could imagine is, so the trend here is probably the same, but like the fluctuations are even bigger, right? So here the drop was larger, and here the rise is bigger. It's a bit unclear what happened here, but I guess it's more or less the same. But then this one's a bit more tricky. No? Okay, there are people who claim this explains a bit like why, like maybe world politics feels more like here, like we're back at kind of eve of the First World War, than kind of how it felt at the peak of globalization a couple of decades ago, right? Now, because of one explanation is, well, in fact, the world we live in looks much more like it looked at the eve of the First World War than it looked at the peak of globalization. Kind of inequality patterns are how to explain that. Yeah.
I just had the question, like, what is it possible to say what exactly caused, like, in the 80s for between country inequality to go down? Is it like because international loans, these kind of development policies were put forth, or?
Yeah. So kind of why this goes down and why that goes up. That's kind of the $1 million question, and I can tell there are different explanations for it. So one is, kind of that there are the two sides of globalization. Globalization, what it made was it allowed the rise of China, the rise of India, and so on. So it contributed to this. At the same time, within countries, think of like the US, what did globalization do? It created winners and losers. It exacerbated inequalities. So, people who work in designing the iPhone in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, they benefited a lot from globalization. People who work in places where jobs were gone and shipped to China, like the Rust Belt or Detroit, building cars and so on, they lost a lot from globalization. And so globalization has these two effects of decreasing inequality between countries and increasing inequality within countries. That's one big force. Of course, that alone wouldn't explain it. So that then interacts with, the neoliberal revolution in the 80s in the US, where at the same time that globalization is pushing in this direction, Ronald Reagan comes out and cuts taxes for the rich, and things of that sort. The social welfare state starts to be cut, and things of that sort. Yeah? And then there's another type of within-country inequality, which you should understand as linked to that. So imagine in China or India, you have kind of within the country a situation that also looks like this, where at the beginning everyone in India and everyone in China is very poor, so there's very few inequality. Once the country starts growing, not everyone grows the same way, and so you have kind of inequality increasing. Inequality has increased a lot in China, but the baseline was very low. Right? So the country starts to get rich. For example, people in urban areas, incomes have increased much more than people who still live in rural areas in China, for example. Yeah? So you have both processes happening that explain this rise. Yeah.
And then also, for example, the urbanization during Thatcher in Reagan. I mean, that's also kind of a globalization trend, but policies in the States.
Yeah. So these neoliberal revolutions usually. Thatcher in the US, some people would say shorter Blair, this retreat of the social welfare state, which has an equalizing role, kind of more embrace of free trade and market-based mechanisms, which most of the time are more unequalizing. There are other people who say, you know, what is weird is not this rise, what is kind of the anomaly is this drop. And so kind of we are back at business as usual. And what is unusual was the Second World War, the two world wars, right? And so we're kind of now, those two world wars were the shock, the unusual thing that happened, and now we're just back at where we were. And there's nothing that's kind of right.
For me, the drop seems quite like the Second World War. Yes, it destroyed a lot of wealth within the countries, but only within the I see that in comparison to all the countries in the world, it seems quite big.
So you have kind of World War II, and then you have kind of the golden age of social democracies in Europe, huge welfare states, which are very equalizing. You have the end of you have decolonization in most of the global south. So you have other things going on. That's kind of a period where inequalities are going down within countries, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like real existing socialism is also playing a big role. No, the Soviet bloc.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly. Because the Soviet bloc is much equal. And so this part of this is also the end of the Soviet bloc, for sure. Yeah.
But you said some people don't get why the shift is only because of the two world wars. But if I got it right, but this graph describes it really well. I think all the things happened what we just said. I think it's pretty clear. I don't understand the view that this graph or the shift in the 40s is that important, because we see now it's back again, and we see the trends are almost the same before 1940. So I think it's pretty clear.
So you would say it's clear to the wars, or?
And the things we said, but I don't understand the view where people say they don't understand the shift in the 40s.
Well, I mean, I guess the debate is then kind of what is the share of the shift that is the war versus other things that were happening.
Just the causal.
Yeah,
the main point.
Exactly, it's a good debate. Okay, so we're going to see later on when we're talking about the theories that come in the debate, there are three views on this. One is these are global structural forces that we cannot really influence. That's kind of globalization, or the world has always been like this, and so we're always going back to this. We might have a shock, but we end up like this, because that's how, kind of big picture theories which would claim policy cannot do much. Then there are kind of the policy can do a lot, and there's the theory, though, and then it's kind of, you know, here it's kind of Second World War, but why does it stay like this? Because there are, you know, socialist policies or social democracies in Europe and so on and so forth. And why does it go up? Because policies change. There's the end of the Soviet Union, there's the end of the socialist bloc, and there's the Noble Revolution in the West. So it's kind of policy driven, right? You can explain that with policies. And then the third view is it's mainly shocks. That's the view of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We say inequality. So the thing that really brings inequality down are catastrophes. It's kind of wars, epidemics, things like that. Revolutions, right? And those are kind of the only events which really make a difference. Otherwise, it's kind of very stable, very persistent. We can talk a bit about those things in a second. Yeah. Those are kind of the three intellectual fields, yeah, that debate on this type of long-term patterns. Okay, this is the same with the Gini index, but it tells you the same story. Then by region, I just want to show that they are kind of, yeah, inequality is high everywhere, but there's still important regional differences. In places like Europe and East Asia being relatively more equal. If you look at kind of the share owned by the top 10%, and there are areas like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa, which are really, really unequal, right? So the top 10% in Latin America earns almost 60% of total income, yeah? And if you look at wealth, it's even more, yeah? Okay, so then let's go to the So I want you to do a little pair exercise for 5 minutes, kind of without looking at the following slides. Try to think of just the link in this direction. So like why or which arguments or which expectations you might have for the effect of inequality, higher or lower, on development. And then if you want to simplify development as kind of long-run GDP per capita, we can also think of it as development in other dimensions. Yeah? So just try to kind of think what could be arguments or mechanisms that might link inequality. So when inequality goes up or down, what happens to that side? Yeah? Take 5 minutes in groups of 2 to discuss. You might have a list of bullet points, and then we'll collect all the things we will compare for Try not to look at the slides, otherwise it's going to take us.
I see it even the other way around. I see more developed place there is less inequality. Because I'm guessing it's not because that the rate of inequality rate that's what I would assume.
I assume the same too, well, I
I think the rest of the
Because usually more equality rises, it's not everybody gets more, it's more high level.
But I think maybe the ideal way is
Probably.
then it's people that manage with the goal of making the more even if there is who it does not make it so we have to change the
maybe there's an outsourcing in the country this is very high percent of population that is really active. You don't see the figures in the country and so on.
Yes. I mean, like, what's also been said with China, China, like, once it became really developed, also really important.
Also die Verhältnisse absolut werden die Ärmeren werden auch reicher, aber die Abstände zwischen den
But of course, yes,
extrem armen
indicator for human development. So there's a human
Those who still manage to get to a high level leave the country, leaving countries for other
keine Mittelschicht gibt, die wirklich viel konsumieren. Aber es gibt darum, ob es viele Leute gibt, die es nicht so
Sorry to interrupt the nice discussions. So I will ask maybe each group just one argument. Not all that you discussed, but maybe just one as an example. One mechanism that might bring those two things together.
In political development in the end of the 19th century, it was like a combination of Rockefeller and Ford, for example. They were like one of the first billionaires in history, and combined they had like they started to develop the whole cars industry, so motorized revolution, and just because of two persons with a high wealth, I don't know what to say. So that led to high development in America.
Okay, so then